Welcome to A Turn for the Better. I'm Dick Singh. Going to touch on something today that most people find an excuse not to use this tool. Or if they do, they use it as a scraper, or maybe to cut glue off of something or something of that nature. But it's a very, very useful tool called the Skew. And I am not what I consider a really, really great skew man, but I do believe that I understand how they work, and I would like to show you my insights on what make them work for me. These are the tools that I mainly use. I have other ones, but when it comes to day-to-day use, these four right here are on my tool racks. Some of the others are put away in drawers. You'll see they're all basically the same tool, just different sizes. But there's some tuning up that has to be done on a skew before I believe it becomes very useful. Number one, these edges are very sharp coming from the factory. If they're not broken and radius slightly, broken I mean making a smooth surface on it rather than being broken. We need that so that it slides and traverses over the tool rest smoothly and uniformly with no bounce. If it is not, it has a tendency to hang up, catch on that sharp edge. Lord, if we ever get a catch, it's going to take and leave a big ding in the tool rest. So you want to get that smooth and even. Normally what I do is I knock the handle off, go to a belt sander, and just run the belt the length of it and just roll the tool back and forth on it. And I just get a nice, smooth, uniform edge. As far as the grind on my tools, I use a curved one. I guess mainly because I've become used to them. I see nothing wrong with the English or the straight grind. I think this performs a little better in a cove than what the other one does. Again, it's all what you get accustomed to. As you can see, it's hollow ground. And when I go to sharpen them, I use my grinder to do the initial sharpening, and then I use a diamond to take and hone it. Being hollow ground, it leaves me two high edges with a cove in between them. So that diamond will lay on the cutting edge and the heel edge, and you can just hone that and get a very sharp edge. And I rarely go back to the grinder with my skew until that becomes almost a solid edge from stoning. Then I'll go back and take and regrind this hollow in there to make it very easy to hone. This tool, when you go to sharpen it, you're not only sharpening the cutting edge, you have the very tips, the heel and the toe. They must be very sharp also. In other words, they're in the same plane and sharp. So hone this surface right along as you hone the other surface. To drive my wood, I like to use an old dead center, which they used to use in the tailstocks before the live centers. Okay, I believe that the four-prong drive has a tendency to take and sometimes split the wood. Plus this has an added feature, which I'll show you in a second. Along with it, I use a cup center in my tailstock. The rim of this, or both of these, are what really holds your workpiece. The unique thing about doing it in this way, I think most new turners are afraid to come up close to the machine because they're afraid the piece is going to fly out and hit them. And rightfully so, until they see what happens. Using this method, all it will do is slip on it. It's strictly a friction drive method. And I think once you try it, I'm sure you'll be very, very happy with it. And I rarely use my 4-prong except in a case where I may have a big, heavy piece that is difficult to drive by friction. When we use a skew chisel, we basically use all of it, but not at once. When I go to rough this down, I'm going to be using roughly the bottom 1/2 to 1/3. In other words, I'm going to be using the heel end, which is the short one. And this is no different than a pocket knife. I'm going to be approaching it where I'm just at a cutting edge. Now as I bring my tool back, I'm going to be cutting in just like with a pocket knife. If I approach it too low, I'm going to be hitting that and scraping it off. That's why I come up at roughly, I'll say a 45 degree. I'm going to be just catching the top of it, and it's going to be slicing it off. Let's give it a shot with the piece running. I'm high enough, I'm riding on the back of the bevel. Now as I drop my handle and bring it in, now I'm starting to cut. Now if I drop that low to the center line, it'll cut it because it's a very sharp tool, but it sure will not take and leave a halfway decent finish. As you can see, it's just basically just tore and ripped off there. Now let's do it properly. You see what's coming off? There's shavings. It's not a torn piece of wood. And we've got a nice clean surface. Now, you can move an awful lot of wood with a skew. Or if we really wanted to get in a hurry, it's already round. Now, when I showed you the position of the tool, when the piece was still square, I don't believe I could do justice to how the tool was actually working. So I've cleaned it up, and now I would like to show you how to position this tool. In other words, I'm riding high. I bring the tool back and lower the tip until it starts to cut. Now, this is one of the things that becomes very difficult for most people to understand, and once you understand it, it becomes so simple you don't even realize you do it. And that is finding the sweet spot, whether it be tipped over this way. Now look at the shaving that's coming off of that versus there's a different shaving coming off of there, or possibly even there. But now that is not cutting. That is just pushing it forward. If we go back at a different angle, now we start to cut. Now, that's positioning our tool this way. If I roll the tool up on its edge, again, makes a difference. And it also makes a difference where it cuts on the tool. Where I'm getting right here, I'm on borderline disaster, bang. Now we've got a catch. With the leading edge, it doesn't matter. I can just jam it in and nothing's going to happen other than fuzzing it up. So what you have to watch is your trailing edge. In other words, if I'm going to my right or this way, this is the leading edge, that's the trailing edge. Again, just changing my angle just changes everything. Now, what do I mean about the sweet spot? When you're cutting, one place is going to cut better than another. See how nice and quiet that's cutting? That's cutting pretty good too, but it's not as quiet. You can hear it starting to protest. Okay, now I'm going to roll the tool over a little bit more and cut more towards the heel. Now you see how the heel is digging in? If I roll the tool back a little bit, now I can just keep rolling it back and moving higher on the tool. Right there I'm starting to get into a problem where it's going to start to catch on me in a real hurry. Now I can change this way and still roll. So it's actually what you're looking for is what cuts the nicest, feels the nicest, and sounds the nicest, because it will sound better as it cuts better. In other words, you want all your senses for feel, sight, and sound. To make it a little clearer, we've changed the position of the camera, so we'll go all over that little bit again. Basically, 45-degree angle, which I said before changes everything. Now, we bring it back until we start the cut. Now, changing the angle changes the way it is presented to the wood. Now, changing the rotation of the tool. That will make it go towards the heel. Clockwise, counterclockwise will bring it back towards the tip. And if you go too far, you've got to dig in. Trailing edge, as we are going in that direction. Okay, now let's start it. If it's coming up too high, I just take and turn my tool a little bit and bring it back down. I think that is one of the things that the rotation of the tool, most people fail to catch. In other words, as I rotate it to the clockwise position, you can see how the cut goes right down the cutting edge to the heel. Now if I bring it back the opposite way, watch the cut go up towards the tip. And there we've gone so far we have a dig in. Okay, let me take a cut with the machine running. Ride high, bring it back until it starts to cut. You can see where the dust is starting to develop on it. That's where I'm going to be. Now if I roll it forward, see how I start digging the heel in? If I bring it back the other way, now it starts to come, but I'm losing my cut, so I'm going to change my angle slightly. And there we are. In other words, there is no one spot that is proper for this to cut. It's an ever-changing position. Now if I bring this around, I have to roll my tool counterclockwise to keep it cutting in the same spot. One more time. Now I've rotated it all the way to where the heel is dug in. I'll slightly rotate it back. Now you can see the cut coming back up the edge. I'm going to roll forward with the handle a little bit. Now I'm making a better cut. Once again, on the start of this cut, I don't believe I really said what the position of the handle is. Of course, if you put your cutting edge at a 45-degree angle, your handle is going to be positioned in the direction that you're going. In other words, we're going towards the stale stock. Okay, as we come back now, as I pull back on the cutting or on the tool, the cutting edge starts to cut into the wood. Okay, now that is how I establish my cut. From there on, it's whatever cuts the grain the best, whatever feels good. Every piece of wood is different, and you're going to have to change yourself around to get what really cuts good. Now there, it's not cutting decently at all. I can live with that. Now this is what we call a planing cut. In other words, what we're trying to do is make basically a flat, straight surface. The easiest cut there is to make with the tool. Once you understand how to move your tool around to get the best cut, whether it be changing the angle of your cutting edge or rotating your tool to help that angle. In other words, if I bring it this way, I may have to rotate the tool counterclockwise to get it cutting back in the area that I want it to cut. We just did the planing cut, which cuts face grain, or the grain running the length of the lathe. Now we have one other direction, and that's end grain. In other words, across that grain. There's two types of grain in any of this, the face grain and the end grain, two different ways of cutting it. If I tried to cut with this surface on the end grain, I'm not going to make it. I'm going to need the point. In other words, the point is going to be doing my cutting as I go down. Now, when we make a cut, we're decreasing our wood diameter, the wood diameter, in two directions. We're going down and we're going in. So to keep that one particular sweet spot cutting, I'm going to have to advance in and down with my tool. In other words, I'm going to be doing an arcing type cut. I'm going to start high. There, it just started to cut. Now I'll just bring that right on down, aimed at my center line. Notice the arc. We're not trying to move a mountain of wood. We're trying to get a nice clean surface. And I say that's pretty hard to beat for a surface. Now, could I use the short end? Absolutely. It's a point. Remember when I said when we sharpened it that I had to get those points sharp by using it in this direction and this direction? This is where these points start to work. I could still take and cut it. In fact, I will. Now, I don't know if you could see there, but I couldn't. So I'm going to use the long point. Now I can see my tool position. And I'm sure you could too. Where this way will be blocked out from my line of vision. This one stays where I can see that my point is cutting. The position of the bevel to the wood, you probably couldn't see it the other way. It's going to be right in a position about so. You can't allow this to cut. You want the tip to cut, but you want that bevel to help hold you. Once more. I'm going to go to the pommel cut, mainly because I have some square wood left. The pommel cut is used quite often in spindles, wherever anything needs to be attached with a square to and then to a round. Now this is basically a cut that will be end grain. Everything here is end grain. We're going to start our tool high, just like we were roughing it out, and I'm just going to follow that down. Now, as you can hear, I'm not applying a lot of pressure. Now, as I mentioned before, there's two types of grain: face grain and end grain. Now our end grain is going to be cut with that bottom heel. In other words, I'm going to be using just the tip of the heel Now if you pay attention, it cams itself in, just like we did on the end grain. On the end, we're making a camming type motion. And now from a different angle, same cut, it's nice and clean. Now, do we have to use the short point? Not necessarily. If you feel more comfortable with the long point, we'll use it. Nothing's torn up. Everything's nice and smooth looking. I think we've got ourselves a pommel. I've reduced the rest of the square down the round. Now, one of the questions I'm hit with all the time is when you're doing a planing cut, do you have the heel first or do you have the toe first? Well, unless it puts you out of position, it doesn't mean a hill of beans. In other words, what's best for you? If you'll notice, if I want to do the long point down at this point close to the headstock, I'm way out of position. In other words, I'm standing almost behind the tool rest, or the headstock. But by going with the short point, I can progress it along. Now, coming back, if I use the short point, I have to rotate the tool 180 degrees and come back, which is okay. But what I normally do is I go from left to right with the long point down, just rotate my body slightly, raise the handle, and come back with the long point down. Why? It's just easy. Now, one of the things that you do not want to do is start on the end of the piece, whether it be there or on a shoulder. Start in just a little bit and then go back and push that off. If you start on the end, you have a chance of catching and tearing some of the grain out, which you don't want to do. Okay, now I'm taking with the short point down, or the heel. I can push that right off, turn it around, bring it with the long point down, push it off. Just makes it simple. And from a different perspective, let's move on to the V-cut. Kind of a very useful cut. Very simple. Again, it's just going to have that arcing type motion. Let's put it into action first. Now, it only goes in so far, and hear that noise, that means it won't cut anymore. There's no room for the tool. So we'll move over to the side. Move over to the other side. What this is doing is cutting material away and making it just like an axe woodworking in here. If you take a cut with an axe and keep hitting in the same spot, there's no room for that axe to go into the wood. You have to chip away from either side to make clearance for the tool or the axe. And the same goes for this skew. So in other words, if you'll notice, I'm starting quite high. See where it's just starting to cut and arcing it in. You can hear when it hits the bottom. Okay, let's get another angle at this. Before I turn the lathe on, let me do this with the lathe stopped. You can see that point is doing all the cutting and it's following down either side. It's making that arc movement. Okay, let's try it in real life. I'll take it nice and slow. Now naturally, if you look, the tool is setting on a slight angle. In other words, we're following down the angle what we want. If we wanted a larger V, I would have to set at a different angle. In other words, I've just increased the angle of that V. Okay, now let's start a new one. Here, make that noise. Let me make it again. Okay, it won't cut. I know if I all I can do is burn it. There's no room for the tool to work. Now all we're doing is making clearance for the tool. Okay, now remember, this is end grain, and to cut end grain, you're using the point. I'm using the long point because I can see what is happening. The short point will work, only I can't see it like I can see the long point. I'm sorry to say I have to break this off. We've run out of time. We will pick this up in the next issue and continue on. I hope you enjoyed this segment, and I'm Dick Singh for Woodworking at Home.